The cardiac monitor in room 7 had been screaming for 11 seconds before anyone moved. The attending on call was 3 floors up in a consult that had run long. The charge nurse was managing a bleed in room 3. 2 residents stood frozen in the doorway, their faces the pale, paralyzed white of people who knew what they were seeing and had no idea what to do about it. The aide, who had been quietly reshelving linens at the far end of the corridor, was the one who finally stepped forward. Her name badge said Stella. Her position listed was floor Aide. She had been working the pediatric ward at Cecilia's Children's Hospital in Chicago for exactly 6 weeks. But the way she moved toward that room, not running, not panicking, just moving with the kind of absolute, unhurried purpose that belongs to people who have heard that sound before in places where ignoring it meant body bags, that should have told everyone something. It didn't, not yet. St. Cecilia's pediatric floor operated on a hierarchy as rigid as any military command structure, though nobody on staff would have appreciated that comparison. At the top sat Dr. Chester Albright. He was 44 years old, trim and patrician, with a voice shaped by 4 decades of being told he was exceptional. He had been attending pediatric physician at St. Cecilia's for 12 years, had published 11 peer-reviewed articles, and wore his expertise like a custom-fitted coat. Something you were supposed to notice and admire. He had not, in 12 years, once taken direction from a floor aide. Stella Vann did not look like someone who would ever ask him to. She was 28, slight, with dark brown hair she kept pulled back in a practical braid, and the kind of quiet, careful posture of someone accustomed to taking up as little space as possible. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that seemed too deep for her age, the kind you earned in low light and under pressure rather than at a desk. Her personnel file listed no prior medical experience. Just a basic aide certification completed 8 months ago, 0 hospital history before that. The Human Resources Department had flagged it as unusual, a woman her age choosing floor aide work, but St. Cecilia's had a chronic staffing shortage, and Renee Quinlan, the charge nurse, had hired her on the spot after a 10-minute interview in which Stella had answered every question concisely, made no demands, and asked only which shifts were hardest to fill. Renee was not a cruel woman. She was precise, efficient, deeply protective of her ward in the way a person becomes after 20 years of watching bright-eyed new hires flame out under pressure. She had her system. Everyone had a lane, aides, stocked and transported and assisted. They did not diagnose. They did not hover in the clinical zone unless specifically called. Stella Vann followed every one of these rules without being asked twice. She arrived early, left exactly on time, never complained about assignments, and absorbed the baseline indignities of the job. The grab me that chart, the get these linens out of the hallway, with a stillness that some of the younger nurses found mildly unsettling. Like someone in the room who is being careful not to take up too much oxygen. She also noticed things. It was in the 3rd week that Dr. Albright first became aware of her, in the way a person becomes aware of a stone in their shoe. Small irritation. Growing. Room 12. A 9-year-old named Danny, 3 weeks post-surgery for a Wilms tumor, was recovering on the standard protocol. Albright had done his morning rounds efficiently, approved the medication chart, and was heading to his afternoon consult when he passed the doorway and found the aide inside, studying the IV drip with an expression that could only be described as concerned. "Can I help you?" Albright said, though his tone made clear he was not offering help. Stella turned. "His urine output has dropped under 0.5 milliliter per kilogram per hour for the last 2 readings. I logged it in the notes. I thought someone should know before his 2 p.m. dose." Albright looked at the chart, then at the aide. "I reviewed this chart an hour ago." "Yes," Stella said. "Are you telling me I missed something?" She didn't flinch. "I'm telling you the numbers changed since then." He checked. She was right. The drop was subtle, the kind of thing that got lost in a high-volume morning, and significant enough to warrant holding the afternoon dose and running a quick renal panel. Albright ordered it without comment. Danny's kidney function came back borderline. He adjusted the protocol. Quietly. He never mentioned it to Stella. But he watched her after that, and the watching curdled into something that looked a lot like irritation. The incident with the port needle 2 weeks later made it worse. A first-year resident was preparing to access a chest port and reached for the wrong gauge, and Stella, passing in the hallway with a linen cart, said softly, "I think that's a 22, not a 20, without breaking stride, without drama, without even fully stopping." The resident rechecked, switched the needle, thanked her. Albright raised it with Renee the next morning. "She's overstepping." Renee, who had catalogued the same incidents and was turning them over quietly in the back of her mind, nodded. "I'll speak with her." She did. Stella listened, said, "Understood, Miss Quinlan," and went back to work. She kept watching the patients with those too old, too careful eyes. Mateo Bautista was 6 years old and had been on the pediatric ward for 10 days. He had a name slightly too big for him and a laugh his mother described as belonging to a room twice his size. He was 3 cycles into chemotherapy for medullary thyroid carcinoma. Rare, aggressive, caught early by an oncologist who had pushed hard on a hunch and gotten lucky. He was also at 3:47 on a Tuesday afternoon, turning the color of old wax and not breathing well. The trigger had been the antiemetic Dr. Albright had added to Mateo's regimen the day before. Ondansetron, standard protocol for chemotherapy-related nausea, completely routine, except that it had interacted with trace levels of a calcium channel blocker. Mateo had been briefly prescribed 3 months ago for an unrelated cardiac arrhythmia, a medication not listed in St. Cecilia's current chart, because the prescription had been filled by an out-of-state specialist whose records had never fully transferred. Nobody had flagged it because nobody had known to look. The cascade was swift. Mateo's QT interval stretched on the monitor. His respiratory rate climbed. He seized once briefly and then went rigid and gray. By the time the desk aide hit the alarm, his oxygen sat was dropping through the floor. Albright arrived at a jog 90 seconds later, took one look at the monitors, and, for just a moment, in a way the nurses in the doorway would later describe with careful, forgiving language, stopped. The monitors said one thing. The child's presentation said another. The combination didn't fit any single standard pathway. Albright was a skilled physician, but skill on a pediatric ward is trained toward expected presentations, and Mateo was sitting at an intersection that looked, on the surface, like 3 different emergencies colliding at once. "Aide Vann, stat," Albright ordered, reaching for the chart. "No." The word came from behind him, flat, absolute, not loud. Stella Vann stood at the door of room 7. She wasn't looking at Albright. She was looking at Mateo, reading him the way a person reads something they have memorized. His bradycardia isn't seizure origin. It's drug-induced. If you push a benzodiazepine, you'll compound the cardiac depression. Her voice was the voice of a status report, drained of everything except information. "You'll lose him in under a minute." Albright spun around. "You are a floor aide. Get out of my..." Stella walked into the room. "Get security. Does he have a prior cardiac history?" She was already at Mateo's bedside, pressing 2 fingers to his wrist in a gesture that was neither a nursing technique nor a standard physician technique, but something older and more instinctual than either. Muscle memory from rooms where the equipment was down and the hands were all that was left. "Arrhythmia. Anything in the last year treated outside this system?" Mateo's mother was in the corner, hands pressed over her mouth. "In March, they said his heart was beating a little fast. They gave him something. I don't remember the name." "How long was he on it?" 6 weeks. They said he didn't need it anymore." Stella straightened. The picture snapped into focus in about 3 seconds. She turned to Renee, who was standing in the doorway with an expression she would later struggle to put into words. Something between frozen and fascinated. "Renee, this is a serotonin calcium channel interaction causing QT prolongation. He needs IV magnesium sulfate, 2 grams over 5 minutes. Get sodium bicarbonate on standby. Bring the crash cart, but do not touch the defibrillator unless I say so. His rhythm is going to look worse before it corrects, and shocking him now will kill him." 1 second of silence. Then Renee Quinlan, 20 years of charge nursing, A woman who had seen senior physicians throw equipment across rooms turned and started giving orders to her team. "You are finished." Albright stepped forward, dropping his voice to the register he reserved for terminal administrative consequences. "You are not qualified to be in this room. I will have your certification revoked before morning." Stella reached out and caught Albright's wrist. She didn't grab hard. She didn't twist. She simply held it. Calm, immovable. Entirely without aggression. The grip of someone who had done this before in other rooms, who had learned how to prevent a fatal mistake without breaking anything in the process. "Doctor," she said quietly, "the child has 40 seconds. You can remove me after." Albright looked at her hand on his wrist, then at her face, then at Mateo, who had gone completely still on the bed, the monitor above him tracing something that looked like a slow catastrophe. He stepped back. The magnesium went in within 4 minutes. Stella stood at the bedside guiding Renee through the rate, watching the monitor with absolute unbroken attention, called the bicarbonate at precisely the right moment when the pH began to drift. The QRS complex on the screen widened in a way that made two nurses in the doorway grip each other's arms. The sound in the room was the high, anxious rhythm of people waiting for something terrible or something saved, with no way to know which. Then the rhythm shifted, slowly like a river changing course, fighting it, then releasing. Mateo opened his eyes. He looked up at the ceiling, then at the woman standing over him in pale blue scrubs, with her braid coming loose and her hands steady, and he said in a small, hoarse voice, "Am I still here?" Stella covered his hand with hers. "You're still here, sweetheart." Colonel Wade Rafferty arrived on the pediatric floor at 4:22 p.m. in full dress blues. He had come straight from a commendation ceremony at the naval installation in North Chicago, had gotten his wife's call in the parking lot, and had driven with his decoration still pinned to his chest and his jaw set in the particular way of a man running on controlled terror. He was large and deliberate, weighted down on the left side with ribbons that represented a career's worth of things nobody talks about at dinner. He had the stillness of someone for whom composure is not a gift but a discipline. The nurses in the hallway moved out of his way without being asked. He stopped in the doorway of room 7. His son was breathing. His wife was beside the bed. The attending physician was near the window, very quiet, very still, in the way of someone reassessing something important. And there was an aide on the other side of the bed, making notations in the chart. And Colonel Rafferty looked at her for a long moment, the way a person looks at something they are absolutely certain they recognize from a context that doesn't make any sense. He walked slowly to the other side of the bed, stopped. "Dr. Vann." Stella looked up from the chart. It was not a question. Wade Rafferty's jaw tightened in the way it tightens when a man is working hard to keep his voice from doing something it hasn't done since 2019, in a bombed-out aid station at 3 a.m. when they finally stopped losing people. Fallujah, March 2019. The forward aid station en route uranium. "You worked for 11 hours on my company after the vehicle strike. You had 2 surgical kits and a generator that kept cutting out." He exhaled through his nose, a slow, controlled breath. "You saved 8 of my men when every metric said we were going to lose them." He paused. "We were told you'd left medicine, that you were gone." The room was very quiet. Renee Quinlan stood near the door. She looked between the decorated colonel and the floor aide and felt the architecture of the last 6 weeks rearranging itself rapidly in her mind. Dr. Albright had not moved from the window. Something passed across Stella's face, not shame, not relief, but something more complicated, the particular expression of a person who has been seen by someone who knows exactly what they are looking at and can neither run from it nor explain it away. "Colonel," she said. That was all. Wade Rafferty reached up and straightened to his full height, and then he offered her a salute, full formal, unhurried, standing in a children's hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and magnesium sulfate, the kind of salute that is not a gesture but a statement of record. Then he said, "And now, thank you." Dr. Carolyn Morrow, St. Cecilia's chief medical officer, arrived on the pediatric floor at 5:10 p.m., having received 3 separate phone calls in 15 minutes. She was a compact, precise woman who had been running complex hospital systems for 2 decades and was not easily unsettled. She became slightly unsettled in the hallway when Renee Quinlan handed her a printout from the credentialing database and said, simply, "Read this before you go in." The name at the top was Dr. Stella Vann. The credentials that followed were not those of a floor aide. She found Stella in the break room at the end of the hall, sitting with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, looking out the window at the city going amber in the late afternoon. Dr. Morrow sat down across from her and put the printout on the table between them. Neither woman spoke for a moment. "Johns Hopkins," Dr. Morrow said finally. "Emergency medicine attending at 26. 2 years with Médecins Sans Frontières in active conflict zones. You're in a State Department citation for a humanitarian response in 2021 that was classified before it could be publicly presented." She looked up from the page. "8 months ago, you filed to voluntarily surrender your hospital practice privileges. No stated cause." She set the paper down. "Why?" Stella looked at the table. "Syria," she said, "the last posting. We were treating casualties from a shelling. I had 3 critical patients, 2 surgical kits, and 40 minutes of generator power remaining." She stopped, breathed in. "I made a triage call. 2 adults over 1 child. Standard protocol for a resource-limited mass casualty. Prioritize maximum survivable lives." Dr. Morrow waited. The child died. Both adults survived. Stella turned the coffee cup slowly in her hands. Her father was Dr. Hamid Youssef. He'd been our local liaison for 14 months. He'd intervened twice with armed groups who wanted our team removed. He brought his daughter to us because he trusted us entirely. Her voice didn't crack. It flattened. The flatness of someone carrying something too heavy for tone to hold. I made the correct decision by every ethical framework I was trained in. I know that. The math was right. She looked up. But I understood something for the first time. Standing outside that room afterward. I understood what it costs. Not you, not the physician, the person outside who trusted you with the most important thing they had in the world. She set the cup down. I couldn't hold a scalpel after that, not because I thought I was wrong, because I finally understood the full weight of being right. The break room held the silence carefully. "So I stopped," Stella said. "I wanted to stay in medicine, near patients, but not holding the knife. Not being the one who decides who the resources go to." She looked out the window at the city. "I thought an aide could just help. Quietly, without the weight of the final call." Dr. Morrow was still for a long moment. "What you did this afternoon," she said carefully, "was not aide-level work. I know. Mateo Bautista is alive because of a pharmacological connection that took you less than 30 seconds to reach. Our attending did not get there. I know. I can reinstate your hospital privileges within. I'm not asking for that." Dr. Morrow looked at her steadily. "Then what are you asking for?" Stella was quiet for a moment. She looked back at the ward through the break room window. The soft light from the patient rooms, the night nurses beginning their rounds, the low, constant rhythm of a floor full of small people working hard at getting better. "To finish my shift," she said, "Bed 12 needs his 6 p.m. vitals, and I'm fairly certain someone left the East supply cart half-stocked again." Dr. Chester Albright found her in the supply room 40 minutes later. He stood in the doorway and watched her count saline bags with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, and he had the uncomfortable experience of understanding that he had been consistently, fundamentally wrong about something. Not once as a lapse, but as a sustained position repeated over 6 weeks, which said considerably more about his assumptions than about the woman in front of him. He was not a man who had been required to apologize often. It showed in the way he had to gather himself before he spoke. "Mrs. Vann." She turned. "I was wrong about you." He said it plainly, without caveat or softening, the way a person speaks when they have decided to simply say the thing and not dress it up. "Not just today. From the beginning, the urine output, the port needle. All of it. You flagged things I should have caught, and I made you pay for knowing them. He paused. That was wrong. Stella looked at him for a moment. You're a good diagnostician, Dr. Albright, she said. Your post-surgical outcomes are excellent. I've reviewed your charts. What Mateo needed this afternoon wasn't a better diagnostician. It was someone who had seen that exact drug interaction in a field setting with no imaging and no backup, and who knew by instinct what it looked like. She set a bag of saline on the shelf. That's not something you train for here. It's not a gap in your competence. It's just a gap in your experience. She turned back to the cart. Next time a patient presents with something that doesn't fit your pattern library, it might be worth a second look at whoever has been watching them most closely. It doesn't always have to be the person with the most letters after their name. Albright stood in the doorway for another moment. Something in his face settled, not humility exactly, but the beginning of it. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. He left. Renee Quinlan was the last to find her that evening. The floor had quieted. Mateo had been moved to a monitored room and was sleeping soundly, his mother dozing in the chair beside him, Colonel Rafferty standing in the hallway outside in a way that made clear he would be there until morning. The night shift was coming on. The day was ending in the way good days end on a pediatric ward. Not with fanfare, but with the simple, reliable fact of children still breathing. Renee found Stella at the nurse's station, finishing her end-of-shift documentation in her usual careful way. She pulled up a chair. Her voice, when she spoke, had lost the professional crispness she maintained through 12-hour shifts. What came out instead was something more worn and more honest. Are you going to leave? She asked. Go back. Stella kept writing for a moment. Then she set the pen down and looked at the ward around her. The low beeping of monitors. The soft footsteps of the night nurses beginning their rounds. The light coming from the rooms where small patients slept and worked at the hard, unglamorous business of healing. She thought about weight. About the specific gravity of a surgical blade versus the weight of a small hand placed in yours, because you are the adult within reach, and they are frightened, and you are simply there. Both were heavy. One she could carry without it, taking something from her she couldn't get back. I still have 12 minutes left on my shift, Stella said. She picked up the pen, finished the chart, and walked back out into the corridor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a toddler was crying softly, and then, slowly, quieting. The sound of a child settling back into sleep, finding it again after the hard part had passed. Stella walked toward it, her steps unhurried, her hands steady, carrying what she carried, in the only way she had found that let her keep carrying it. Not as a surgeon. Not as a hero. Just as the person who was there.